Hi, welcome to this Open Security Summit session in December 2022. And we're going to continue actually a couple of sessions we've done in the past, where we're basically going to be talking about privacy and the challenges that have been happening recently. And I guess even since the last time we spoke, there's been even more bigger changes in the sort of this crypto and privacy world. So there's definitely really cool topics. So I'm joined by Anish and John. And we're going to basically be talking about these topics. And maybe let's just give a quick intro, just who we are, and then there's other people that we'll bring in if to comment. So I'm Dinis. I'm the chief scientist of Glasswall, and I'm the CISO of Hall & Barrett. And also I help to drive the Open Security Summit. So I have quite a lot of opinions on security. Anish, quick intro about you.
Sure. I'm Anish Mohammed. I am the chief scientist of Panther Protocol and the CTO, and that's me.
John?
I'm John Marshall. I'm the director of the World Ethical Data Foundation and the CEO of the World Ethical Data Forum, two counterpart organizations looking at clarity and investigation of information space generally, and ethical practice. So we develop tools and do some consultative work as a foundation with governments and corporations. And we have an annual forum, which we've just wrapped up. And some of, in fact, the content is relevant to this conversation. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invite.
Cool. All right, John, do you want to kick us off?
Me? You want me to start?
If you want to,
okay.
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, so just so we can get a little bit of context, how would you like to treat? I mean, the area of tornado cache and all of the implications are so complex, I think, and wide-reaching that we could go down an enormous number of rabbit holes, from sort of open source development and the nabbing of the street of development and developers to I think the intricacies and the elegance of the code that's being produced and published, and it's being taken offline. So would you like to frame it, or would you just like me to sort of plow ahead?
Yeah, no, that's good. Pick one of those and let's continue. Yeah.
Let's start from there and let's see where it goes. It's like, as John pointed out, that lots and lots of ways in which this could go. And some sets of things are more interesting to me than others. And we shall see how it goes.
Well, why don't we start by, can one of you guys just give a 2 minutes, just sort of story, right? Like what it was, what happened, what was the thing, and what was the kind of the peak and then the crash, right, of the whole thing.
Anish, what I'll do is I'll just frame, I suppose, the difference between the technicality and the questions of principle behind it, and then I'll hand it over to you to give a bit of biographic sort of history, if you wish, about the tornado cache stuff. So I suppose what needs to be said in the outset is that privacy is an elastic concept, and it shouldn't be surprising to anybody. I'm sure it isn't at this conference particularly, that it's a concept that stretches all the way from sort of heaven, protection of civil liberties and human rights on the one hand, to the hell.
I'm sorry, my connection. I'm having a bit of a difficulty with the connection.
Okay. So again, it just covers this wide range of harms, individual harms, and civilizational sort of harms through the absence of privacy.
Let me connect back with my phone. 1 sec.
Okay.
Shall I just continue? I mean, Anish is going to know this stuff anyway. So, okay. So how can I frame this? I mean, since the inception of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, I mean, the meaning, the scope, and the limits of the human right of privacy have been sort of very much, and very passionately contested. So, fiercely advocated for on the one hand by its defenders in civil liberty, and then variously continually pressured, restricted, and frequently contravened by companies and governments across the globe. What should remain clear, I think, in any discussion, however technical it might become, is that as fascinating as the privacy technologies are in this case, we really, I think, have to be careful not to become distracted by technical details merely. We have to recall, I think, the questions of principle behind them. And in the case of privacy, there are, especially significant reasons for this. I mean, the intellectual challenge and the moral maturity, I suppose, required to maintain an awareness of the horrors that I've mentioned, privacy can mask, stuff that, again, everybody is over familiar with, whether it's child pornography, or it's terrorism, or it's the usual suspects. No surprise, given the things that people actually do to one another sort of all the time, and the way that human rights themselves are, the compliance with human rights is the exception, geographically, currently, as well as historically, rather than the rule. So there's that awareness on the one hand of the horrors, and then there's the awareness of the horrors, I suppose, that arise from privacy being absent and essentially prohibited, so that lives are helpless to think, or to move, or speak, or commune, free of the watchful eye of some, I think at the very best, not pernicious authority. I mean, that kind of maturity, that kind of cognitive effort is hard to maintain. I mean, we know this from the case even of properly encrypted email. We speak all the time with people who work in this space that, as I've said, it is used for human trafficking. It is used for drug deals. It is used for child pornography, with terrorism. And yet we still cannot countenance, I think, the absence of encrypted private email or anonymous communication, due to the very well-known consequences of this not existing. So in sum, I suppose it just remains to be said that sort of privacy is a human right, obviously, but it's not important because it's a human right. It's a human right because it's important. It's not a human right on whim, but in consequence of the very long, painful, hard lessons that history has taught us. And really, it's in this light that I tend to view the Tornado Cache peculiarities. Would that do for an overview?
Yeah, that's cool. And then, but what does he make in this case, like the Tornado Cache, like what are the big questions that you say it asks, right? And that we want to basically, really look at.
Yeah, I was going to hand this over to Anish. Is he not back yet? Has he vanished?
Yeah, he's back. Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, so apologies for my internet connection. I'm in India, so the internet connection is a bit not very stable. When I last talked to John, we had at least 5-6 times dropped off. So apologies to everybody up front. So I could probably start the Tornado Cache at a very high level and walk through these implications, at least to the level of software licensing, and then I will leave John to actually go into software licensing. So the challenge that was there that's been exposed by Tornado Cache is that a piece of software written by a bunch of people, which is decentralized, being released into public. In some sense, there are a bunch of rules which are different in different parts of the world. And in one part of the world, it might be legitimate. In other part of the world, it might be legitimate. And it so happens that the piece of code, in terms of Tornado Cache, implements some functionality that provides the ability for certain transaction to be shielded from the public in that sense. So typically, when you do any transaction on blockchain, everybody and their dog on the internet will be able to see it, or on the blockchain can see it. So what Tornado Cache allowed to do is at least provide some shielding. It doesn't completely prevent anybody from doing anything, but provides an amount of shielding, depending upon how you do it. And what has happened is one of the regulatory authorities decided that is a bit too far, and they decided that they're going to block it. So the first order effect of that was one of the people who are the founders of this protocol. There have been a bunch of charges raised against him. He has been held in jail for the last, I think, 30 to 90 days. I suspect 90 days, and the charges have been brought forward. Immediate effect is that anybody who writes any code, there is a risk. This is how I put it. There is a risk that if you implement certain functionality, and if this functionality is not compatible with a particular region, you might be exposed to the legal implications of actually writing software. That's the first one. The second part of it is more general in the sense, like if you actually have to comply by a set of regulation from a particular region, that implies you can actually have a consensus on a blockchain with multiple versions. So imagine you have a US regulator requirement and everywhere else in the world. So if you have nodes running in the US, the nodes running in the US have to absolutely comply by the US requirement. Whereas nodes running everywhere else will be open to being compliant to other things. So there is this possibility for consensus, which is like one of the basic functionality of blockchain. You have a duality existing that is kind of breaking the consensus in that sense. The second part is like, even though everybody thinks of Web3 protocols as being decentralized, they generally use Web2 services to exist. So if you think about it, if you think about Tornado Cash lives on top of Ethereum, which sits on top of services like Infura. So Infura sits on top of Amazon Web Services. So there is like, if ever there is a regulatory requirement of a particular region being published against a protocol, this propagates backwards. So, if you have an instance running on Amazon Web Services will stop providing you with services. And that will imply that Infura can't provide you with services, and that it will imply your protocol dies out. So this is like one of the many implications of what is happening. And about software licensing and the rest of it, I think John would be a much better person to talk about. John, back to you.
In terms of local licensing, I think that that's one of the points of contention here. It's that the general sort of OFAC sanctions and the sanctions of the US Treasury are ambiguous in some instances. I mean, there's talk of there being overreach. Some talk of there being, in effective cases, impotent precisely because of jurisdictional plurality. It's one of the curiosities about, I think, Tornado Cash is that, as an entity, it's hard to sanction because it is sort of DeFi, and it exists as code as much as anything else. So there's a tendency, I think, for it's hard even to talk about regulation in this instance, because the overreach is such that it's meant, I think, as much as a dissuasion or a disincentive to development and to implementation as much as anything else. But there are consequences for the using of these solutions. On the one hand, which I'll talk about in a second, there's a consequence ostensibly for being them if there's an entity which can be held accountable. And more and more, I think, immediately worrying for this conference, there are potentially consequences even for participating in the creation of these solutions. And the chilling effect on privacy innovation is much more interesting to me in this regard. So, I mean, to push this back to you, Anish, I mean, how do you see, as somebody that's running essentially a DeFi org and developing the technologies sort of around it, how do you find yourself situated vis-a-vis policy and regulation in this regard? I mean, is this something that you're aware of globally, or is this something that you're more aware of in terms of US sort of policy? I mean, how do you frame your risk in this regard?
John, are you asking the question to me, or? Yeah,
to you directly, because you're in the business of creating, in some sense, a DeFi solution using ZK snarks.
It's a very tricky one. So it's like, if you are a creator of a protocol, you have to balance this act. I mean, I can't, answer this as in that specific instance, but I can talk in terms of more general cases. So if you were to compare the protocols that are there, so for example, if you look at Zcash uses snarks, and it does actually provide, privacy, and they have been in operation for a while. And similarly, Monero, they use bulletproofs as the mechanism to provide privacy, and they've been in operation for a while. And there is also Aztec, who are also using snarks and are providing privacy in one sense of speaking. So, it's a very fine balance to be had, because it's it is almost impossible for one to actually be 100% sure that you are in compliance with all the regulations around the world and still be able to deliver. At the same time, even if you were to do that, your risks sometimes might be much higher than most people might be willing to underwrite. So this is a kind of a tricky one. Like, I really am in high awe for people like Zuko, who has been running Zcash for all these years, because given all the regulatory pressure that's being put forward against the privacy coins as such, this is a big thing. Whereas if you look at Panther protocol, which is my protocol, it's much smaller construct, which is like we only do some certain operation, provide privacy for certain operations, that too while supporting KYC and selective disclosure. So that's like an incredibly small subset. Whereas people like Zuko and others have the full set, which is like, we provide privacy for any and all transactions on layer one or on a blockchain. So that's I don't know how they managed to navigate that. I have no idea how they've been doing that. And, I wish at some point in time, if they were to share how they do that to the larger public, that'd be useful for other people who have, zero knowledge constructs providing privacy and protocols will definitely find it useful.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because the way that this Tornado Cash issue has come to the fore is largely in light of the possibility of its being an instrument for money laundering. In essence, it's an architecture that incentivizes, all of those people who are inclined to launder their ill-gotten gains. They can do so sort of with relative, anonymity and relative security through something like Tornado Cash. And so the regulatory pushback. So generally the structure is that it's able to help disguise, I think, the proceeds of criminal activity as ostensibly legitimate funds, or simply to make, I think, illegitimate funds indistinguishable from legitimate funds by disguising their origin. I think that's a good way of sort of characterizing shielding. Cryptocurrency generally offers, I think, some advantages for both purposes, but the anonymity solutions such as Tornado Cash have really sort of enabled this in a way that has, how can I frame that correctly? It's hard, as you've said, to deal with this with a concordance of regulatory agreements or consensus. And so taking the European Union and the European Council, they've taken a general position on money laundering right now. They've agreed new AML sort of regulations that I'm sure you're dealing with. Their new AML D6 directive, for example, is set to pass once it goes to the European Parliament for hammering into shape and agreement. But that has had a few interesting consequences. So there's been a lot of press around the large cash payment limitations on, anything more than 10,000 euros is impossible, et cetera, et cetera. But the thing that's sneaking through really is that it requires all crypto companies, and they specified explicitly, to conduct much more rigorous due diligence on their customers, which sounds good and is good, but they've said that, and they've explicitly stated that they have to have the transfer of crypto assets more transparent, and then they explained that as being fully traceable, and that is, directly in tension, I think, with many sort of architectural designs or design specs for the solutions. So this, of course, means in toto that technologies that act at all to obfuscate identities or break affiliation or chains of ownership become targets by default. So the new AMLAs will be able to impose sanctions and penalize actors that don't comply, and therefore, I think, which by design cannot comply. One of the reasons for this is that it makes for a catch-all. I mean, general solutions. Bruce Schneier puts this really well. Outlawing certain types of technology as a whole is, however complicated in itself, much easier than determining who or what is European or what kind of transaction is European in any particular case. And that's why, any of the implications here are of global import rather than just local relevance. So it's curious. I think that we see that it's to the advantage of policymakers and lawyers and governments to treat everybody in some sense as if potentially their business model is to become a tool of the Lazarus Group, rather than maybe they're having been motivated to safeguard civilization or culture, the public and liberal culture, against unwarranted surveillance or the dependence upon centralized authority whose character can change at the drop of a hat. I mean, it's a really interesting sort of situation. It seems like a sea change.
Yeah, because where do you stop, right? The problem with that, it's
There
almost
is no
one of
stop.
it's almost ironic. Like if you think about it, like what they've done now with Tornado Cash, if they had done the same thing 7 or 10 years ago, they would have banned, a lot of other technologies when they were in their nascent, when they were about starting up, right? And I agree that the balance with privacy there is one that we have to be careful not to basically create a world where you cannot have that, right?
I mean, it's also the other side, right? There is an ongoing, competition between mostly the West, as we see it, and China, right? And that's a machine learning AI arbitrage that's ongoing. And what is being missed by a lot of the policymakers is the fact that, China's data is not visible to anybody, right? Whereas if you have no privacy, all the data from the Western world will be accessible to Chinese. So if they were to run a machine learning algorithm, they will have a advantage over the West, and that will definitely put the West, is at a disadvantage. So maybe this is something that policymakers should really think about and see if it's worth, making such decisions, and the second order impact of that is worth the upside of doing something like this.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of overreach by policymakers has had all kinds of really interesting effects. I mean, we were feeling this today as an organization ourselves. I mean, everybody is probably aware of the way in which trolling was a direct consequence of the sanctions. I mean, people realized that any contact, in some sense, with Tornado Coin, any currencies that moved through Tornado Coin and found their way into a wallet, appended a question mark, I think, to the legitimacy of that wallet and the legitimacy of the funds in them. So, celebrities were being sent cryptocurrency, and it became this really fun attack vector for several people. But whereas it's an interesting headline in such cases, when you are dealing with, I mean, who's an obvious example? I mean, WikiLeaks, right? WikiLeaks, you're raising cash the only way you can through crypto, for example, and suddenly your Ethereum wallet is dusted with Tornado Coins of contaminated money. That can sort of mean that any of the resources you had as a crypto are down. I'm just taking WikiLeaks as an obvious candidate target for Western organizations. There is an explicitly sort of declared war against crypto in some sense. The crypto problem, as GCHQ has put it. So that is something that when we were considering sort of funding mechanisms for WDF, we were wondering whether at this time it's wise even to have an open, donation sort of mechanism or wallet for Ethereum. Because if somebody just decides to, copy paste the address into Tornado Cash, and we find that we are given Tornado Cash, which is still functioning for really interesting reasons, if we end up with funds there, it's just a matter of somebody deciding to sanction, in some sense, WDF in this instance, or any one of you in the audience, I suppose. I mean, those attack vectors open up almost by default as soon as the horizon of possibilities begins to be better understood. With, I think, local changes or overreaches when looking to solve particular local problems, we find that there are all kinds of sometimes unintended, sometimes for authorities really convenient consequences. So what I suppose I'd like to touch on in that regard is that viewing, I think, the Tornado Cash issue, we still do so either through a technical lens. We do so very much through a West European American liberal lens, in light of, I think, policy. But some of the work that WDF has been doing is with people who, one of the directors of the Democratic Voice for Burma, for example, who is in touch with resistance fighters there, and how they're to receive financing, how they're to obfuscate in some sense their identity online so that they're not subject to, their families aren't subject to persecution, sort of even abroad. The same for parts of Iran. Afghanistan has experienced similar issues, that sometimes who pays who can be a matter of life and death, and that really has nothing to do with crime or money laundering or making bajillions of dollars sort of on the side, or through scams or terrorism or anything of the sort. It's literally just having regular contact that we would take for granted. But these things become a very different sort of danger for those that use cases. A very sort of danger that's treated, I think, of and helped by stuff like Tornado Cash. I mean, that's one of the issues that we're conscious of, is that we think in glamorous terms about the big villains, but in fact there are so many people sort of around the world that depend upon, I think, the support and assistance of the work done by developers looking to protect identities, just to enable everyday human transactions.
So can you expand on that one? Because I feel that this conversation is always tainted with the two extremes, right? It's always tainted with one angle. Like we know that in order to create, sorry, I'm just going to take my camera because I need to work out. But in order to create a system that is anonymous and private, right? You will allow a certain degree of bad actors in the mix, right? That's almost the by design capability. You cannot have it almost both ways. But one of the things I spend quite a bit of my time doing is trying to pick up the signals, right? And the difference between a real bad actor, right? And sometimes power users or other mixed in the middle. So can we think of a solution that let's take that example of those journalists or those entities, right? That we want to make sure they are protected, right? So can we create a system that, there is a connection somewhere within the trust network, right? Because there's always a trust network, right? If you think about it, none of these individuals, none of these things exist in a vacuum, right? Is there a way to allow good players to exist in this anonymous privacy world that in a way force almost the criminals to reveal themselves in a way that they would not be comfortable doing it? It's almost like building a network of trust on top of it that allows a moment in time to basically give, maybe some individuals access to a platform. And I know that by design, this is a backdoor into the system, but that was always going to be easier to protect and easier to make sure that it's a network that's, it's almost like if something goes wrong, you just destroy a key in one place and everything else goes back to being rebuilt. Does that make sense? What I'm trying to put here is how can you design something that allows those players that we want to play to exist and almost have a way for them to join this club, knowing that somewhere in a line there has to be somebody who goes, yes, this is a good player, but there's always going to be entities that you trust, right? There's always some entities that you have to trust, right?
So your suggestion is finding a solution that enables us to encrypt and keep private messages between trusted players, but not allow that liberty in some sense to those we don't fully trust. Is that where you would draw the line? It's that if there's a possibility that this is a terrorist or a money launderer, or whatever it's going to be, this person doesn't get the benefit of strong encryption. Is that what you're saying?
Huh? Okay.
Dennis.
Yeah, sorry.
Hello?
I can hear. So you're saying message between trust and fear?
No, is that what you were suggesting? That you would ideally like to draw a technical sort of distinction.
So he's on a work call. But saves us £5.
I think there's somebody else's.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. That was sorry. I just had to jump in the car. Can you guys hear me now?
Yes, yes. Yep.
Yeah, good. Yeah. Sorry. So John, yeah, go on. Sorry.
No, okay. So I'm not sure if you heard that. I was just wondering really how you would sort of tease out, I think, the solution you were looking for. I mean, is it a technical solution and solutionism that you're striving for here, where you would afford strong encryption, I think, to those you weren't able to fully trust, however we could possibly identify that. So the burden of proof in some sense goes on whichever side, but we're able to say, look, these people like Anish, I fully know is a legitimate player. We can give him all the encryption he could possibly eat. John gets all the encryption he could possibly eat, but Dinis is a little bit shady. We should not allow him to have strong encryption or the benefits of strong encryption or financial transactions that are anonymous and private. I mean, how do you identify ahead of time the players?
I think the world that you describe already have, right? Like, people that almost like we won't trust, eventually they will be able to live in that world where you don't have anonymous and privacy, right? That's where we are today in most of our existing world. What I'm thinking, it's almost a bit like the initial DNS design, where there was a number of people that really hold the keys, right? So let's say the three of us, right? So let's say that the point here, imagine a platform that allows through anonymity and privacy once you're in. So once you're in, right, you can know that there's like 3 players in there that have full anonymity. So when they are in that platform, they are fully private, full anonymous. So what you want is to make sure that there is some kind of validation for that entity to commit. But it's almost like the Tor network, right? Like after a while, you don't know who's in there, right? And the thing about a lot of these things is about breaking the economic model of the sort of the criminal activities. Do you know what I mean? So if you create a model that, for example, imagine we having to have even some physical or some kind of way to validate that you want to operate anonymously in privacy, and then eventually you lose that access, right? Or you lose that capability. So in a way that you have to go back to a trusted network, so that the people that we want to protect have a way to regain that access to that private environment.
Did you find this quote? No.
Anish, do you want to take it, or?
I am not sure I fully understand the line of reasoning. So
I'm not quite clear on it either. But it strikes me that maybe there's a slight conflation about the role of the developer here, in essence, and a conflation of the role of law enforcement with the role of developers. Yeah. I mean, this is a typical sort of point, sort of made regularly, but it's maybe worth reiterating. It's that sometimes we can find ourselves bluffed as developers into seeing the world and what we're creating through the eyes, I think, of those with particular sort of vested interests in a state's national security or a financial institution's particular financial sort of imperatives or concerns. When maybe the solution is to create the very best privacy tools we can, as responsibly as you or we can, and let law enforcement sort of work out how to do the really tough job of law enforcement themselves without playing police officer for them. I think this does make a bit of sense.
Yeah, I kind of agree with John in that sense. It's like being the judge and the juror, I don't think is the role of the developer of the protocol or any mechanism in that sense. I mean, let the law enforcement and the authorities that actually make rules kind of make themselves clear on how a particular mechanism should be implemented, and maybe try as a developer we should try our best to comply with that, rather than to think the other way around. And I'm not so sure we can even convince the authorities that we are doing the best. This is a challenge. So if there is no well set norms available for one, then even if you were to try to do your level best, you might not meet the requirements of the law, and then that puts you as a developer in a very tricky spot. So we should try to do what's best, based on our knowledge of the law and try to comply by whatever that's at that point in time, the known implications of the law, and like try use the technology at your disposal to make it compliant, but draw a line underneath it and say, in the next step, when the law enforcement wants to do something different, then let it go through the legal system, and then we change everything and try comply by it as a next iteration.
I mean, it's really complicated, and this is not a solution at all. And I'm aware that I'm dodging the question, but I think it's because maybe the question or the burden here being put on developers is misplaced, frankly. I mean, privacy solutions aren't designed in the main to. They became such a prominent concern in the early days of the internet. An internet which wasn't designed, I think, with security and privacy in mind at all, proliferating, I think, a need for privacy solutions. But privacy solutions became so prominent because people are aware of the threat that, policing and law enforcement and governments can pose to a population. That's, again, implausible for people to entertain the idea of if they're, on the streets of maybe Berlin or whatever it's going to be, and they feel sort of relatively comfortable with a lack of, I think, historic sense. But again, if you're elsewhere, you're aware of the variable, in essence, that the character of governments and law enforcement can be. And privacy solutions are there sort of in certain cases to protect precisely, I think, against autocratic and tyrannical regimes as much as they're anything else. And so I do think that this is one of the fundamental tensions, is that to what degree do those concerned with the creation of solutions that have this general beneficial, make this beneficial sort of contribution potentially to the long-term security and stability and flourishing of a civilization or culture, however inconvenient for law enforcement it might be, so that's kind of, forgive the peppering here, but I'm just trying to think this through. I think that it's a misplaced burden, in essence. I think that we have to remember that this is not privacy out to protect those who ultimately aren't in danger because they're living in a very safe suburb of a very safe country, but rather privacy solutions are there as a catch-all safety solution, whatever the circumstances might happen to be due to sort of historical contingencies. I mean, India has altered, I think, in its character over the last sort of 20 or 30 years. We're seeing changes there where privacy technologies now are being reached for in ways that, much more eagerly than they were just 10 or 15 years ago. Afghanistan has altered enormously. As I've mentioned, Myanmar has experienced enormous changes on its streets, and it's one of the most rapidly declining sort of digital jurisdictions on earth right now, where these things can be a matter of life and death. And there's no guarantee of the future being kinder to us, when I think there's plenty of evidence that history has been pretty unkind to populations, whoever they might be. And we should be careful, I think, judging the relative security we might enjoy as a representative of the sorts of assistance that privacy can offer those globally, whether that's a financial transaction because somebody's sending their aunt from America to Afghanistan some cash by Bitcoin or not. So yeah, I do wonder about this, and I tend to think that we need to just let those whose priorities are law enforcement do the law enforcing, and developers be compliant with regulations as they come, but nonetheless do their very best to make sure that they maximize the principles they really believe are most important, mindful of why they hold those principles in the first place.
But aren't you talking about the balance that has always been basically in the, actually it was always been in the balance, which is the views of the people who developed the encryption algorithms, for example, PGP and everything else, right, in the last 20, 30 years. Mm-hmm. And everybody else that since the beginning, it's almost, I think, since the beginning of the first encryption, there's always somebody who says, we can't have encryption because we need to be able to see it, right? And And the solution and I think the problem is that when you say, well, law enforcement needs to have access to, the current solution on the table is, well, they need a backdoor, right? Or they need keys. And that's a challenge, isn't it?
In fact, I wasn't saying that. I wasn't saying that they need to have access or backdoors. I was saying that probably it's better that they don't, and they have to go around doing their law enforcement in other ways. I mean, it represents a place where we have to make a decision. Either we don't have privacy or we do. I mean, it's a practical matter, right? It's not freedom and privacy aren't had in principle only. They're either had practically or they're not. And the kinds of technologies and the architectures we're developing are partly definitive, I think, of what that means in the modern age. So
no, I agree. Can I just go back to the point you were making on the chain of custody of the software, right? Isn't there a problem that if we allowed that to happen, where the software gets almost judged by how it's used, you go back again to the age old of the people that were doing security tools, right? The people that were publishing technology that was in both offensive and defensive at the same time, and you couldn't really draw a line between an offensive tool and defensive tool, right? Like, how far do you push that?
Or even just an educational tool, right?
Exactly, so right? An education tool, right? Like, there was a time where people in black hat would be freaking sent to jail, and they'd be prosecuted, right? Just by being there, right? And eventually the industry matured, right? To understand that actually, although there is a lot of companies with the egg on their face, ultimately we are more secure, right? Ultimately, we all improve when we know those gaps, right? And also, I think the challenge there is that we risk making every single, you're also responsible for the use of your code in any jurisdiction around the world. There's always going to be a place where they can say that code is illegal now.
Yeah. I as far as I've understood you, I sort of agree. I mean, there are all of these variables that are outside our control. And I think that sometimes we just need to resist being bluffed into thinking that the whole show is our responsibility, in essence, because there are many jurisdictions, as Anish said earlier, there are many priorities that various law enforcement sort of entities have over time, even through time in one particular region. As you've implied, those who are, white hat hackers, black hat hackers, sometimes the distinction is merely an intention and aim, really, than method or the code being used. Matthew Green at Johns Hopkins University, professor of Chomsky, the case being taken up by EFF, is also, he was pressurized and his lessons taken down because they made explicit reference to the code of Tornado Cash and everything else. I mean, a lot is swallowed up, I think, when we begin to be a bit loose in our commitments, I think, to the things we've created. I mean, we can inadvertently restrict our freedoms over time without realizing we're doing so, just by conceding ground where we needn't do in the first place. And as we've said, there are entities that are there that can empower themselves in ways which are rights respecting, civil liberties respecting, to do their job as effectively as possible, to get warrants. And it's really curious.
John, I was about to say something in a sense, like the lessons learned from Black Hat and DEF CON, things of that sort. Yes, if you go back and look at one's rights to actually disassemble any code and things of that sort, it's been severely restricted over time. So it's like there's always been this challenge. If the entities on the other side have more power, more influence, this could be in the form of, say, large corporations with DRM, so Adobe, for example, had the ability to actually prevent a lot of the speakers from speaking about mechanisms that are broken, right? So then the question then becomes, is like, where do we draw the line? And given I have some involvement in developing a protocol that acts privacy. I mean, I'm not at the liberty to make any views or share any views in that sense. But I think overall, if you were to think about this as like security and privacy and evolution over time, some of the trends are not that great, which is definitely not indicating that the evolution of technology and privacy over time has been, not giving the people or the consumers the rights they should have whereas like tilting slightly towards corporates or governments who have a larger set of resources and ability to enforce, kind of control the data and all the data, metadata, and probably even messaging of the users in that sense. That's how I think about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, people who are interested in design, people, architects like, Anish and yourself, if privacy by design is to be taken seriously, if privacy is to be literally baked into the architecture, eyebrows at least need to be raised when you're being asked to bake a lack of privacy into an architecture by design. If it's the case that we see the Council of the EU agreeing regulations now, which insist that crypto. There's something else to say here in terms of the broader context of privacy, and that it's not only the financial world which is experiencing this kind of pressure. It's all its medicine and medical sort of confidential, sensitive medical documents and communications tech as well, and the going dark sort of issue around this. It's a broad sort of array of pressures, of which financial behavioral data is only one. But anyway, if the implication is that when you're developing, you have to make your stuff fully traceable, that is, I think, equivalent to the alteration of blockchain into something which pretty much immediately feeds into central banking solutions for digital currencies, as far as I can tell. I mean, it seems to be correlated with this inclination too. Do you find that the CBDC, the horizon of CBDC is also something that plays into the severity of the pushback against crypto mixers or anything else, or encryption solutions, strong encryption solutions for transactions?
You're kind of asking me, or
just asking generally, I suppose. It's that, again, one of the reasons that I tend to be a little less lenient with demands that we loosen encryption in the case of financial transactions, though I recognize the really serious importance that criminals and terrorists and the whole show are held accountable. I just think that this is the wrong way to go about doing it. Is in light of the increased availability of what had been, confidential information elsewhere, how much identifying information is available, and in light, I think, of analytics and data aggregation resources now, these things become really seriously a database state. But sorry, Anish, what I was going to balance that with is the CBDC sort of stuff I was mentioning.
Okay, sure. So the way I was about to say was the following, right? Like, as a nation state, if you are thinking about yourself as a nation state, you are having an adversarial, another nation state working against you. If you were to think about Ukraine versus Russian Federation, if Ukraine had a CBDC and Russia had a CBDC, and Ukraine CBDC had privacy, Russia didn't have CBDC, it'll be pretty easy for Ukraine to actually have very high resolution economic data by just connecting to the CBDC of Russia and understand what's going on a continuous basis. So there is that from a nation state perspective, from a policy perspective, the makers of CBDC should be aware of. At the same time, I also recognize the challenge of privacy for an average user when a CBDC is being built, right? So how I don't think it would probably be seen as the same levels of priority as the privacy of economic matters of a nation. So I don't know. Like these are some of the open questions that should be asked and explored and looked up in detail.
And ultimately, right, I think what we also
John, can you
I,
hear
I'm,
Dennis?
I can hear you, but not Dinis. I think it's great. We can just talk, and if we're accused of not being on topic, we can always say that we didn't know what it was.
That's a good strategy. Yeah, I mean, I was just about to go back to the CBDC question, right?
Mhm.
The CBDC question would be, if you are an authoritarian nation state, there could be no better tool than a CBDC in one sense of speaking. And also, if you are a state which actually, really cares about privacy and democracy and, national security, maybe privacy being inherently built into a CBDC could be another way to look at it. This is my thinking, and I could be completely wrong, and I'm not a policymaker at all. I come from a very technology perspective. What do you think?
You were breaking up terribly as well. I'll just again say something in response, and hopefully it hits some kind of mark somewhere. Yes, I mean the kind of instrument that at least the fantasy of the CBDC sort of technologies that are being propounded are all horrifying. I mean, they're all terrible. It's switching currencies off. The whole show. This stuff is the fabrication of a nightmare. But what's curious to me is how much complacency there is in some sense about the currently increasingly perilous state of privacy, and also why we had these concerns or priorities in the first place, and we should sustain them, whatever the specter of the threats are from terrorists or from drug dealers or human traffickers. I mean, these are nightmarish considerations that we need to stamp out, but that shouldn't come at the cost of one of the most legitimate and important safeguards, I think, for a secure and flourishing liberal civilization that we possibly have, which is the ability to, I think, commune and speak freely and privately with one another. And that can have to do with simply the transaction and the helping of people with cash where necessary. I mean, there is a human concern here and a trust concern here, which matters enormously.
Is Dennis still offline, or can you hear him?
Yeah, I can hear you guys. Yeah, we can hear you guys.
Okay, so sorry, Dennis, but you kind of dropped off, and like
No,
my connection
that's
wasn't
all right. I
great.
could actually hear you guys. Okay, it's just I think my audio was a bit delayed. But I get the point I was just making there is going back what John was just talking about is that I feel that we need to have a set of strong commercial models and a strong of governments who now pick up the privacy a banner and then and help to fight this, right? Because if you have every single government in the world saying that they don't want privacy by design, and you don't have any major corporation or major entities or global organizations that can pick that battle, then it's not going to happen. But if you can have like it happened before, like EFF, and a lot of others pick it up, but I think the stakes are getting higher now. So I do think we need to have some big players in the mix that put privacy at the heart of what they do, especially like you said, it's not just this data, it's medical data. There's all sorts of data that gets more and more important that we protect.
Yeah, and when it's treated collectively, I mean, this is a remarkable, I think, constellation of data points, which are revealing in ways that we could, I think, hardly imagine. Especially with neural networks and deep learning, it's tremendous. I've been spending some time with some academics doing work in this field, and it truly is, I think, remarkable what can be elicited from this. So yeah, if we care about it, I think we have to be a bit more hygienic, and to the point of having models which lead the way or which incentivize, I think, innovation. One of the lessons, I think, historically is that people innovate and find ways to make opportunity, whatever the horizon is. If it's the case that we don't disincentivize data exploitative, identity exploitative technologies, that is going to be profitable in some way or other, as we see with Cambridge Analytica and other matters. If it's the case that there is stringent regulation and people really applaud the idea that, inconvenient as it can be, harmful individually as it can be, being a shield for harms. Strong encryption is just a fact on the landscape, and it's one which we're not giving up for certain reasons. That too is going to result in just a new field or horizon of innovation. So financial opportunities will emerge immediately.
Absolutely. Cool. Look, I think that's a great way for us to end. Any final thoughts from you guys? Let's do another one. I think this is definitely a massive evolving topic.
This
is going to be definitely.
It's a horribly complicated area with so many implications. It's very hard to know where to begin and end. But Anish.
Yeah, I was just about to say, the episode of Tornado Cash started like 90 days ago, August 11th, when Alexei was actually arrested in Netherlands, and just prior to that, OFAC actually added the Tornado Cash Ethereum addresses and a couple of other addresses to their sanction list, and we still are trying to understand the implications of it. As John was saying, Matthew Green teaching a course and putting a link to Tornado Cash code. If it just elicited the kind of reaction, we are just waiting to see the implications of it. As I was describing, sanctions have implications all up the way on Web 3 and Web 2. So if Web 3 gets sanctioned, Web 2 will get sanctioned by proxy. So, when a larger set of applications and things are getting impacted, I would love to see, where that leads up to in terms of decision-making processes and, various other criteria, and see where it evolves to and where the lines get drawn. That's what I would say. So definitely a very interesting place and a very dynamic place, and lots of still unknowns in that sense.
Yeah, and one of the things that isn't unknown, just to wrap up, I suppose, is that we have, I think, we have this central concern of human rights generally, which is not an arbitrary sort of dictate or set of values that are being plucked out of the air. And there's a growing legitimacy around human rights for a reason, and it's because it's an empirically proven sort of body. It's almost a historical testament of the errors and the horrors we've committed against one another. It's worth feeling that human rights are likely going nowhere, and they're going to become increasingly important. And if on the one hand you're being told by a state, whether it's Afghanistan or it's London, the London mayor, that you should be compromising privacy for whatever reason, weighing those two things for me seems a pretty trivial sort of outcome. It's clear that a human right like privacy, for the reasons that we hold it, is going to weigh far heavier than the inconvenience that privacy affords, I think, law enforcement in such cases as money laundering, for example, horrible as that is. So it's about balance and priorities and proportionality, and I think that in this instance, this human right is a human right for a bloody good reason.
Yeah, brilliant. All right, guys. Well, thanks for joining the session. We will share the recording, and then I'll see you in the next ones.
See you soon. Thank you.
Brilliant.
Thank you very much. Thanks, John. Thanks, Dinis.
Thank you, Anish.
Bye.